Hello and welcome to another instalment of the UK TNS Radio. We just about made it. Sorry for the delay, a few little technical hitches there. As you could probably guess, Lou isn't here at the moment, so it's me, Malcolm, Massey, that's basically going to be hosting the show today. And I've got alongside me Brian Gerrish. Hi Brian.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Jolly good. And today we are going to be talking about the police, which is following the recent police conference yesterday that Theresa May gave. So we want to look a little bit at that, and we're also going to be looking more in depth at the police and the police history, how they were, how they came to be, and what they're moving towards, what the new drive is, why the new drive is the way it is and where it's going, and where we ultimately think it's going to end up. So Brian, would you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, yeah, the first thing I'd like to say is that we decided to do something on the police because it's obvious to us that so many people across the country are watching what's happening in policing. I've got to say that the police at the moment are getting a lot of criticism from a lot of different directions, and I personally feel some of that is justified and some of it isn't justified. So what certainly I'd like to see this afternoon is that we're going to talk through issues connected to the police and policing, but our aim is to try and get out facts and the truth about matters so that we can all learn from it. At the end of the day, the police do a very tough job. They don't often get a lot of thanks for it. But if we at the moment look at what's happening in the country and we start to see that particular parts of our society and politics need cleaning up, it seems to me that we're going to need the police to do that, and therefore the police, have got to be on side, and so what we need to do is to be trying to get a message across, obviously to the ordinary audience, but also if there are any policemen listening or ex-police.
Police ladies.
Or police ladies, indeed, yeah. We want to show really what we know, what we're thinking, and the ultimate aim is to help get people working together, in a better way, so that we can deal with some of the more serious things happening in society.
Yeah, definitely. I'd just like to add that I think I agree. I think the police have come into quite a lot of criticism in the last couple of years, and I think that some of it has been unwarranted. And I would also like to sort of suggest that policemen and policewomen are simply, not just simply, but they are policy enforcers. So it's not necessary that we should be directing our dis-ease or unhappiness with the police's performance at the people who are actually providing the service, but I'd say more the people who are creating the policy which is driving the police force, since the police are contracted and under oath to obey the policy that they are given.
Yeah.
Would you say that's a fair
comment? I would say that's absolutely fair.
Right. So should we have a little look at the Theresa May's police conference to the Federation rep yesterday? I think it was at Bournemouth. I think that was correct.
Yeah, that's correct. Well, some of this has been reported on the BBC News, but earlier today I was having a look through the major newspapers to see what they've been reporting on it, and unless I've missed some of the key reports, I can't actually, across the Daily Mail, Mirror, Daily Express, Mail, and the Independent, I can't find significant content on this conference, although there were 1,200 police there, and obviously Theresa May, as Home Secretary, got a particularly rough ride. So I wonder whether there has been some form of mild media clampdown, because obviously what took place at the conference was, I think, controversial,
Sure.
and maybe the mainstream press are shy of it.
Well, I believe actually that Theresa May refused to be photographed there as well because of the type of signs that the Federation were holding up behind her, such as that she was, or not necessarily her, but that policies were going to destroy the policing in this country, and some of the signs were not particularly, how should we say, tactful.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you who haven't seen any information on this, the key point was that the police Federation annual conference in Bournemouth was packed, 1,200 officers. As Malcolm has just said, there were a lot of banners where police were expressing grave unhappiness, and it was obvious that Theresa May went into a very hostile environment, and I don't think she conducted herself in a particularly brilliant way, because at the end of her speech to the conference, she was met with a wall of silence, right. And I think that probably says it all. But at one point, one of the police officers present called out that she was a disgrace, and that produced a huge chorus of applause and cheers from the audience. So we're getting very strong indications that the police here are looking very closely at Theresa May, and more importantly, they're looking at the sort of policies that she's trying to implement, of which, aside from cuts to the police, the key thing, which is obviously coming through, is to do with the privatisation of the police, or
yes, definitely, yeah.
Secondary police services. And Mrs. May said to the conference that it's not about privatising the police. In fact, her words were, "It is because the police are crime fighters that we will never privatise policing." The moment she'd made those comments, people in the audience were actually speaking out and saying that this was completely untrue, because of course the Tories at the moment are pressing ahead with the privatisation of police.
Absolutely.
We've got companies like G4 Security that are aggressively recruiting officers from the force. They're hoovering up people who've already left police service, and they're certainly targeting existing ones. And then we've got organisations like Serco that are doing some of the ancillary jobs. And in the background, we've even got other major players like IBM, that are being brought straight in to work almost as part of the British police force.
And there's some relatively unknown IT companies as well, such as Stereo, which has a private agreement with Cleveland Police. I believe that's in the Stockport area, and a lot of these companies are unheard of. I think Serco really was pretty much an unheard of company sort of 12 months ago, and yet when we look into Serco, we see that actually they offer us a broad range of services across a great number of industries, including nuclear, schools, hospitals. They are really a massive company, and I think when we start looking into companies like Serco taking over the police, it sounds fantastic on the outset when we look at what they can provide as a sort of cost to performance ratio. But when we consider that same company has its, should we say, fingers in pies in other industries, then I think it becomes quite worrying, because at the end of the day, this is a private organisation. It's run by private individuals, and yet they are gaining increasingly more control over our industries and services.
Yeah. And obviously we're seeing from this conference that the police are picking up. I think we had some of our supporters were down there at the conference, and they were talking to police. It's very interesting that the reaction from the people on the ground was that the police were very, very friendly. So overwhelmingly, most of the police were prepared to talk if they were asked questions about what they were doing at the conference and what they felt and what they were unhappy with. Very friendly, reacted extremely well to the members of the public who were obviously posing those questions. And I've just got to say, we did have a little bit of a coup, because a wonderful lady called Margaret Carroll, who's a grandmother, she's done a huge amount of work in order to assist us with talks and getting information out, but she positioned herself close to the entrance, and she was rewarded by being in position when Theresa May arrived, and she was able to actually hold up the latest edition of the UK column. We're filming at the moment, I think, so I'll just put it up here. So Margaret was able to wave her paper, and she suggested, I believe, to Theresa May that the policemen were ready to arrest her for treason when she went inside. So Theresa May scuttled in, But obviously she would have felt that people are now starting to watch what she's doing and exactly what policy she's trying to push through. So we'd like to thank Margaret Carroll for her work there.
Yeah, very big thank you to Margaret.
Yeah,
Very big
it was filmed for the BBC, and in fact the film clip with her did appear on BBC lunchtime.
1 o'clock show, yeah.
1 o'clock show.
Yep.
But we believe later on that film clip was taken down. So we do have some copies of it, which will be posted in due course. But unfortunately, the quality is very poor because they're secondary videos. But nevertheless, the UK column was present at the conference in Bournemouth.
I think actually it's a really good point to make while we're at this stage, that it is a great job that Margaret's done, because not only has she made her opinions heard, which is fantastic, she's also very gratefully for us, she's given out a good number of UK columns, but I think most importantly to police officers, the people we really need to sort of build relationships with again, because I think at the end of the day, if we're going to bring about a peaceful change in this country, then it does need the officers of law to actually recognise what is going on and how things could be changed and maybe bettered. And I think doing that kind of work, what Margaret has just done, is exactly what we all should be doing, which is great.
I couldn't agree more, because we are trying to get a message across. We're trying to get out what is the truth. Well, we believe it's the truth. It's certainly not what's being reported with the BBC. And the only way to do this is to speak to people. And when you do this, you've got to treat them as proper human beings, and see whether you can engage them in conversation. And I think that unfortunately we had to get to a position where times were starting to get tough for the police. The police have been through many years where they've still had a hard job to do, but they were receiving a reasonable pay rate, and there were bonuses and there was overtime. So I'll say in a way the police have gone through the good times, and it's only now that we're starting to see the pressures really coming on the police. And of course, now that we've got police who are feeling that they're being forced out of service, or they don't like the culture change within the police force, this is now starting to focus their minds on what's really going on. And I think that's made them more receptive to people who are starting to say, do you know what's going on? Yeah. Probably as another example, when the public sector demonstrations were on in London, I can't remember when that was, in November, 10th
of May, wasn't it?
Well, we had some early ones last year,
of course.
But we had Parliament ringed with police officers, and I mean ringed. The police officers were standing shoulder to shoulder outside Parliament, and together with some other people I went along the line and I spoke to individual police officers and groups and asked them if they knew why they were there, and what I found is that although they were initially a little bit wary of you and why you were asking them questions, they very quickly started to say that they were also very concerned with what they were seeing happening in the country, and they were very concerned about what was going on in Parliament. Yeah. One lady said to one of the police officers that she said the trouble is that you're here to arrest the wrong people, and you should be arresting the people in there, pointing at Westminster. To which the constable smiled and he said, "I'll tell you what, love, we know where the real criminals are." So you just see that now we're whatever it is, 3-4 months further on, the pressure's really starting to come on the police, and now we're starting to see them challenging the system.
Sure. Which is why I mentioned the 10th of May marches that the police made recently, which I think is showing that. And I think obviously we'll get a little bit onto this in a bit about the sort of old powers that the constables had, which have been taken away and has sort of disabled them a little bit. But I think going back to what you were talking about, I think sometimes we forget when we're dealing with people in costumes and with titles and things that we forget that they're human beings as well. You know, we've all got children in hospital, children in schools. We've all got people in hospital that need looking after. You know, we all have to pay council tax. We all have to pay taxes that we feel are unfair. Although obviously a lot of people now are starting to resist that, but nonetheless, what I'm trying to say is that the police are going through the same sort of austerity measures as we are. and a bit of sympathy on our part, as much as a sympathy on their part is required, I think.
Yeah. I had some other comments on the screen here, which came out of the conference. So Theresa May was pretty aggressive at one point. She said, "Let's stop pretending the police are being picked on. Every part of the public sector is having to take its share of the pain." And she added that while the 20% budget cuts were challenging, that's always a good word, isn't it, challenging, they must be seen through. They've got to happen for the good of the country. So you can see that Theresa May was there, in my opinion, she's starting to try and twist it to blame the police. If you actually resist what we're trying to do, then you're actually acting against the good of the country. But the piece with the bit about this, which is so blatantly untrue, of course, is that we know that these public sector cuts are simply as the result of international banks saying that they want money back, or they want their interest back from us, and there is no money because of the debts to the international bankers.
No.
And where did they get the money from? We're pushing this point a lot now. They created the money out of nothing and then loaned it to the government, who ultimately pays back the capital sum and the interest by taxing us.
Well, I also would like to add as well that really we're being given thin air, and we're actually paying it back for our sweat equity, for our hard work.
Yeah.
Because every individual out there has to go out there and work an 8 to 12 hour job every day, and that's essentially what we're paying back, is our hard work is really what's going on here, isn't it?
We asked some of the police in Westminster, the ones ringing Parliament, about their pensions. Were they going to get their pensions? What was in the pension pot? And this was something that clearly triggered them. And we did also say to some of them, and you say it with a smile on your face because it just helps things, where does money come from? And it was very interesting. Some of those police came back and said, it's made out of nothing. Mm-hmm. So here is Theresa May. She's pushing across the common lib-con line at the moment, isn't it? That there is no money. And yet we've got a tiny little nation called Iceland, not so many miles away. And how have they solved their debt problem? They've solved it by saying, we've now come to the understanding that the international banking debt imposed on Iceland is fraud. We are not going to attempt to pay the debt back. So little Iceland has made a very brave decision, which is that they are simply not going to pay this fictitious debt back. Has the country collapsed? Has the Icelandic economy collapsed? Absolutely not. Iceland is not only stable, it's actually moving along.
Moving forward.
Yeah, moving forward.
Hence why we don't hear anything about it in the mainstream
media.
Well,
that was going to be my next point, because the one country that we never hear about at the moment is Iceland. Meanwhile, the BBC is covering us with horror stories about Greece and Spain and Portugal.
Sure.
So Mrs. May's words to the conference, disingenuous, you could say that, but I believe these politicians are now lying because they know what the truth is. And what we see Mrs. May trying to do, and it's happening with the NHS, is everything is coming to austerity cuts in order to pay money back to international bankers. Yeah. Probably we ought to say to the police, it's a shame that you're not investigating the international bankers.
Absolutely. I just want to go back a little bit when you were talking about pensions and pension pots. I think it's a difficult point to make, and if there are any police constables out there listening, I'd like to say I'm saying this very gently and very calmly, but it always seemed to me that the very sort of high-paid pensions that white-collar employees get, and police officers and fire service members who do a fantastic job, they are much higher than everybody else's, and it did always appear to me to be a slight bribe in a way, because the people who are most comfortable in this bubble that we're all living in often find it very difficult to act, because they're afraid of, quite rightly, they're afraid of losing what they've got, which is a natural human instinct. But I think that, as has been mentioned in this Federation presentation by Theresa May, the pensions are going to be looked at. They're going to most likely remove the 30-year pension, which policemen got after 30 years service, so they could retire at 50. The pensions are going to be cut, and so really effectively what's going to happen now is that the police constables are going to find themselves in very much the same position as a lot of people in Britain do, and I think that's when we will most likely start to see action.
Yeah, well, the pension situation is very interesting. Really, if you go back, well, certainly if you go back 30 years, it was generally acknowledged that people working in the public sector did so on lower pay scales. They were providing a service to wider society. They were civil servants. They were earning generally less than in the private sector, but it was acknowledged that part of the reward was that when they did retire, they had a pension which was generally better than people on average in the private sector. So the reward for doing your job and serving was that you could look forward to actually retiring and being comfortable. And I think one of the things that we're seeing here is that we are now pushing the police into the rat race. They've got to compete for their money, their set targets. And the more you do that, the more people, in my opinion, the more people's attention is going to be on the money and how they get the money in to live and feed the families and pay the mortgage. It's not going to be on relaxing and doing their job. And of course, a lot of the public sector jobs, the military, it's certainly the case. They're not paid for 8 hours a day, they're paid for 24 hours a day. And so I can see that this monetary system is being used to tighten down on the police so that it's going to put more pressure on them in their job. But it's only going to be the older ones that recognise it. There's another little point which I nearly forgot about here, but one of the things that Theresa May was sort of boasting about was that all sorts of ideas have been put forward to actually help the public service, the police service. And one of the ones was that they were going to be bringing people into higher ranks in order to boost the performance of the service. So instead of people coming in at the same rank, going through the same training and working up, you were going to bring in these I'm going to call them leaders because I think there's a particular connotation to that.
Leaders without authority.
Possibly, yeah. But we're going to bring in people from the outside who are going to come into higher ranks within the police force, and according to Mrs May, somehow this is going to improve policing. Now I find this particularly interesting because if I go back, I don't really want to go back this far, but if I go back into the late 70s, very early 80s, we saw in the military, and I can talk firsthand from the Royal Navy, we saw the drive to bring in people from universities and giving them instant officer rank. So we had people who were coming in and being given the rank of lieutenant, or in some cases lieutenant commander. And I've got to say, some of these people were unbelievably dangerous because you had people coming in, they then had a rank on their sleeve or on their shoulder, so other people, other ranks assumed that they had knowledge and experience of the job, but in fact they had no knowledge and experience of the job. And if they had enough humility to admit they didn't know, that was okay, and there were some good people. But we also saw people that came in and immediately got this elevated rank, and yet they had no knowledge, no experience, but they thought they had the capability. So we had one or two instances where the situation could have been quite dangerous. These unqualified people made decisions because they were cocky enough to think they knew it all. So I can see that police officers, I think this is another wedge to actually destabilise good professional policing. What Mrs May is suggesting, I don't think is a good thing. What you're actually doing is not bringing in these miraculous leaders, you're starting to water down what good policing is about, which is experience on the beat. You've been out there probably for years, getting to know what it's like on the ground.
Getting to know the community as well.
Get to know your community, and then if you've actually got the professional and educational ability, you are then moved up through the ranks to start to control other police officers. So I think that a lot of Mrs May's improvements to the police are actually designed to break down the strength, the present strength of the police force, which is experienced officers.
Well, yeah, I would completely agree with that, and I suppose I would add that it could also be a tactical placement of particular individuals who are already, say, have an allegiance to a particular group that maybe they shouldn't have. You know, well, for example, I mean, I'm sure viewers will appreciate that we spend a lot of time looking at directors, don't we, and trustees of certain organisations. And I think what we've commented on before in the past is that some of these people, they seem to have sprung up from nowhere, all of a sudden being given a directorship from nothing, literally from university, and you have to wonder, how did that person become a director of quite a large corporation at such an early age without having any experience whatsoever? And I sometimes wonder that, as we know that politics is a very tactical game, that if you can put someone in a position of authority that has an allegiance to you and your agenda, then that makes the imposition of your agenda much easier to attain, I think.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I definitely think this is happening, and if we give a parallel example, we could have a look at the fact that Francis Maude in the Cabinet Office, Francis Maude MP in the Cabinet Office, and their leadership team have been pushing through the idea of giving sort of fast-track super training to the top 200 civil servants. And the UK column has reported on this in some detail, but at the time we did it, this was just emerging. We're now in the situation where this training is actually happening very quickly. So we're seeing within the civil service that the political parties, so in this case Lib Dems and the Conservatives, are selecting who they think the top people are, and then those people are being fast-tracked through a leadership training process. And of course what we've been flagging up is that the organisation that was going to run that training process was Common Purpose. And we now also know that the training is going to be done linked up to the Side Business School and Oxford University.
Sorry, would you like to comment, because I know you've been reading Julia Middleton's book recently, which is why I brought up Leadership Without Authority. I didn't know if you wanted to make a comment on that. Or?
Well, a point we've always been very, very concerned about is that if we look at what Common Purpose talks about in its training. One is it's talking about achieving change, and this is a common theme. Cameron was elected on the need for change, but they don't actually define what the change is going to be. So we're going to train people, we're going to train them in change in society, but we don't specify what the change is. And then when we read Julia Middleton's own book, to see what she's talking about, she's openly talking about using people in order to achieve political and social change. But it's the way we're going to use them. We're going to use useful idiots. This is her words, not mine. Useful idiots and expert idiots. What she means by an expert idiot is that if you've got somebody who's actually qualified and capable, a doctor or a university professor, but you can mould them, you can nudge these people to do the political job that you want them to do, they're an expert idiot.
Well, sorry, that's really interesting. Just quickly add that Mr. Windsor, who's been brought in to look at the police and give some sort of advice to the government, has actually called for recruits to have a minimum of 3 A-levels and a promotion based solely on the skills they've got, as opposed to time served. And Ofqual came out recently, I think it was either last week or the week before, saying that A-levels were seriously dumbed down and that they were very worried about the way that A-levels and that education system was heading.
Yeah.
So I think that ties in very neatly and nicely with what you're talking about, with Julia Middleton saying they're going to use useful idiots, I think.
Yes.
So yes.
Yeah, and we can also pick up on some words here, and I'm going to say I really hope that at some stage serving police officers are going to be listening to what we're talking about. But you see words being used. Change is a very common one now, but we're also talking about transforming. We're going to transform Britain, we're going to transform the police service. And who is using this type of language? Well, it comes into this same quasi-political group that is talking about creating a parallel system of governance. This is their words, and they have a political agenda, but we're going to do it by bringing in our people who are trained, our leaders, our future leaders. And you can see that if you look at the police force, there's been a huge change in the police, certainly over the last 20 years, and we now have more and more of these people at positions of power at the top of the police pyramid who, when you analyse their careers, I got to say some of them appear to be superhuman at the speed at which they've been moved into higher rank.
Yeah.
And also we're seeing people, let's say they're coming into an anti-terrorism position. Now my brain probably influenced a little bit from my military training, but says somebody coming into terrorism has got to know about it, and you don't suddenly go through from being an ordinary beat bobby to moving across into a specialist area like this. You are going to be put through a stream where you're immersed in this stuff so that you really understand it. But we've now got police officers who are suddenly appearing as counter-terrorism, head of counter-terrorism, and you say, what is the background of these people to do it? And I've got to say, one officer that immediately comes to mind is Cressida Dick. And you look at this lady's background and you say, how has she managed to power her way through the police to this highly specialist role? Another senior police officer is Sarah Thornton of Thames Valley Police. Also now, I think she's number 2 with ACPO, with a responsibility for counter-terrorism. And if I look at the type of CV I've got access to, which is what the average member of the public can find, it doesn't stack up. So my belief is that we are seeing that within the police, the desire is to bring in placemen who are going to help the desired culture change within the police. I'm not sure I've explained that very well, but it's to do with embedding politically active people in the police instead of choosing the people who are skilled at basic policing on the streets.
Absolutely. Well, it's a bit like Brzezinski, isn't it? It's kind of from the inside out almost in a way, isn't it? By
transforming,
yes, transforming from the inside out as opposed to influencing. I think we certainly see it as well. I mean, I'm quite young, but I certainly remember seeing a lot more middle-aged to older experienced police officers on the beat, if they were on the beat, whereas now I think there's a massive influx of young officers, which is fantastic. I'm not saying that it isn't, but I think if we start losing the experience side of the police force, when I think if John was here, he'd probably say that they were being encouraged to take early retirement from the police force, that then we suddenly get younger people who are less experienced and less educated in the law, because they certainly, I don't think a lot of police officers don't understand not only their position in respects of the community, but also their obligations and duties, but also their powers.
Well, I can give another parallel example here, which I come back to the Royal Navy. When I joined the Royal Navy, I joined as an officer. I went to Dartmouth, and although that may sound grand, you start at a very low level. If you go to sea as a midshipman, technically you're an officer, but you are treated as very low down the pecking order by everybody because you know nothing, and you learn from that. But when I joined the Navy, the main career list was called General List, and if you signed up for General List, you were joining the Navy at 18 and you were going to be retired at 55. So you were looking to give lifetime service into the Royal Navy. You obviously went through the training, you learnt, you specialised, you gained experience, but it was a career. You lived it. your families lived it, because most people would live in service accommodation. Some people would find it a bit too intense and would make sure that they broaden their circle of friends to people who weren't services. But many people, their whole life and existence was within the armed forces field. Now, what that did was meant that you had people at sea who were highly experienced. They'd seen it all, they'd been there, whether it was the rough weather or the military, the warfare situation, or the equipment, or what was going to happen with your team. You'd seen it, you'd lived it, you'd had a huge amount of experience. And what the experience gave was stability to the whole thing. Now, out of that core, what obviously the Navy was then looking for was people who had something extra. So these were people who had really deep insight into what was going on, and I'm going to say in theory, those were the people that were then elevated to the higher ranks. Now, I think that police officers listening to what I'm saying will recognise what I'm talking, because the old police-style police officer joined up as a policeman for life. Now, what happened in the late 80s and into the early 90s was all of a sudden there was a change agenda started to come in the Navy, and basically what that agenda was looking at was the fact that in the future people will not want to be in the Navy for a full-term career. And I distinctly remember somebody saying to me, what they're actually suggesting is that people will come into the military and leave, and then maybe a couple of years ago come back again, just like people move around commercial jobs. I'm working with Boots. I've been working with Boots for 3 years, but my next job is going to be with another commercial company, and then I'm hoping to move to another one. So unknown individuals were suggesting that the RN had to start preparing for more short career, where people were only going to be in for 5 years. And of course, if you take a specialisation, submariners, highly specialised, you make a mistake and possibly you're going to lose the whole vessel, or even aviation. You know, at 5 years you just started to gain experience. So my professional background says what we're actually starting to see occur with the police is that there is an agenda to break down the experienced police. And of course, when the culture of an organisation changes, who are usually the first people to go? The long-serving people who see the greatest change. Yeah. So what I think Mrs. May is doing deliberately is to drive out the experienced core of the police.
Well, I suppose in that way there's less chance of her being challenged, isn't there? Because I think that if it's the same with anything, if you're ignorant of something, you're ignorant. It's not a put down or anything like that. It's just ignorance just describes a lack of knowledge in something. And if an officer comes into the job young and they're not taught the proper procedures and the proper duties of a police officer or police constable, then they're just not going to pick up on the problems. And so I think for that reason that there is a very good reason why the sort of experienced police constables are being pushed out.
Edged out, yeah. Well, I think that on the subject of the conference, it's been really fantastic to see the passion that's starting to come out in the police, and clearly I think we're going to see some disagreements between the Police Federation and ACPO, Association of Chief Police Officers, because we're in the situation at the moment where ACPO is operating as a private company.
Yeah.
But to my mind is clearly very, very closely aligned with the senior political elite.
Absolutely.
And I, as a member of the public, if you look at the police force at the moment, you see these two types of policemen. You see policemen who are clearly there doing what they're supposed to do or trying to, and then we've got other policemen and women at the moment whose agenda seems to be much more political. Yeah. And they are politically correct. They're following the diversity training, and it's those people who are actually having the influence on the change in the police force.
Yep, I totally agree, and I think while we're looking at the changes, I mean, we can see that the police officers are at an all-time low in their numbers for the last decade. There's about 136,000 of them now, and yet we're still seeing a further attack on which will lead to a reduction of even more officers. And the thing that would be concerning about that is that when we're looking at the sort of the overall political spectrum, we're starting to be concerned that there's going to be maybe a level of social dis-ease or social unhappiness in the next forthcoming few months or maybe year or so. It's a worrying concern that gap is going to get bigger and bigger with the number of officers leaving, and it is going to be filled by private officers.
Yeah.
Officers coming from literally private companies, as well as police support community officers as well, which we'll get onto in a bit, but also which they don't take an oath of office.
Well, this is true, and of course Theresa May is there as part of Cameron's cartel, and as we've been pushing out quite a bit over the last couple of months, let us not forget that David Cameron was pushing Bill Bratton, the ex-New York policeman and Kroll chairman or vice chairman, I've forgotten which he was. But we've got David Cameron. I just cannot think of a bigger insult to British police to say that in the whole of the British police force there's nobody better qualified to police London effectively than an American. Absolutely. What an insult. The whole culture of American policing, the difference in culture in society in America, and yet here we have David Cameron wanting to push into a position of immense power, an American who is currently working for one of these huge private security companies.
And let's not forget the relationship between Kroll and the recent incident with Ian Puddick, and how Kroll managed to get Metropolitan Police to act in a way that Kroll would like, even though Kroll, of course, is
the judge in the court case is on record of saying that he has never seen anything like it, that a private security company favoured by Mr. Cameron, clearly favoured by Mr. Cameron, was able to put such pressure on the police that they spent £1.5 million persecuting and trying to prosecute a plumber. It's amazing, isn't it? So I think something very good happened in Bournemouth. Because I think that Mrs. May would have gone away realising that the police are not going to be a pushover, and I'd like to say to the police, well done, and can we also thank the police present in Bournemouth for the kind conversations that they had with members of the public. So thank you for that.
Yeah, a job well done, I think. A job well done. So, would we continue with the theme of police? Should we go and talk a little bit more, do you think, about constables and what they were, what powers they had, or would you like to move a little bit more on to where we feel they are now and where they're going?
No, I think we should I think we've got to go back to a position. We're saying things are changed at the moment and are changing increasingly quickly. Yep. I think it'd be an important thing to just spend a bit of time talking about really what the police were, what the police should be.
Are you suggesting that we delve into territory that Mr. Cameron won't do, which is to say what we're changing from and what we're changing to?
Well, absolutely, I think we should do that. That's why UK Column Radio is working. We're trying to get alternative views out on what's happening out there. Yeah. So I think the key bit with the police, we touched on part of it, is the fact that the police were originally set up to serve and protect us. Yep. And we can be realistic about this, because police officers, I'm trying to think of the name, a very good book I read, which was by a senior police officer who spent his career up in London, and a lot of his time on the beat had been in some pretty rough areas of London, and he was quite frank in the book and said there were times when we had to sort of take justice into our own hands. But overall, what the police were there for and should be there for are to protect us. Yeah. And arresting criminals getting through the justice procedure, that's one thing. But the key thing is that the police are there as a way of keeping the peace, of keeping order. And I think it's true to say that the majority of people 30 years ago, maybe if we go 40 years ago, which I'm not feeling so comfortable with.
Well, I don't think I can go that far.
But if we go back, the average person regarded the police as being good. You went to the police if you had a problem. Some people would say some areas there were bad policemen. That must be correct. But the general image was that you had people who were doing a good job, and if you went to them, they were going to try and help you.
Well, they were often very respected individuals in the community.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
And what were they like? Well, we could start to say, well, of course, the police were selected on a particular basis. There was a height restriction, and you wanted officers who were sufficiently physically robust, that called on to do a job, they could do it. But it's very interesting to note that for the bulk of their career, the police officers were unarmed. They had a truncheon. There were instances during some of the bank raids, or when armed robbers were cornered, that the police were using firearms. But we know that for many years British police were regarded with praise, really, for the fact that they did their policing unarmed, whilst there were people in the criminal community who had access to firearms.
Well, I think it's a sense of, I might be a bit out here, but I think it's a sense of taking the moral high ground, really, isn't it? That human beings really should be able to interact in a society without the use of violence, and I think it was certainly a commendable thing that the police policed as far as they could without using deadly weapons, which I think because they've increasingly, I suppose, been made to, through the policies put in force, they've been increasingly made to take a step down from that higher ground. I mean, certainly I've noticed a lot of police officers now just generally are armed. I mean, I think they are still special constables. I often see them. I've seen a few in my neighbourhood where they're driving in unmarked cars, and I've spoken to a few, and if they're not carrying a deadly weapon, they're carrying a taser, which of course can be deadly. And I think that that's where a lot of the respect came from, is that they refused to sort of step down to the level of criminals who did resort to lethal weapons such as guns.
Yeah, well, the police were putting their bravery on the front line, and the other side of it was that criminals who were armed knew that if they used whatever arm they'd got, knife or gun, the case was against them, because the police were unarmed. I think this is quite an important psychology. If there are any police out there listening to this, and you'd like to give us your opinion on this particular issue of what the relative balance is of armed versus unarmed police, we'd be very interested to hear. But of course, if we're going back to 20 years, 30 years, we're saying that there were weapons in society, but we had a police force that was working unarmed, and there seemed to me to be a peace about things. Now, we've seen massive changes in society, which I think we might touch on, and obviously the police have had to respond to that. But,
well, I think it would be unfair not to touch on that, I suppose.
Yeah, but we can even just look at the policeman as he was, and we're looking at dress, and we had a uniform which is expected to be very smart, and I certainly know that included polished shoes, but police officers were wearing, I've used the wrong word, which we'll come back on to, but police constables were there in their white shirts, and they were wearing a uniform which was a smart and reasonably functional uniform. And what we've now seen is an amazing change in uniform, so that we're looking at not only officers dressed in black, but now festooned with as much equipment as we see the troops going into battle in Iraq or Afghanistan. And one of the particular parts of the uniform which is now changed, and I've got to say I absolutely hate, but it's the introduction of the baseball cap.
Right.
Okay, the American military have been using baseball caps for some time. Germans have had a sort of equivalent called the forage cap, but once I started to see police officers dressed in these black baseball caps, there was something thuggish which had started to overtake them. And then of course we've ended up in the all black uniforms, a black t-shirt, and we're looking at men in black.
Yeah.
And why is this? Why do we need the police in black?
Well, I think from a perspective of someone who maybe wants to bring in a different agenda, I think that what we've seen is a much more aggressive style of dressing people. You know, we see people with equipment on their chest, which makes their chest look much bigger. You know, and they look broader. They look. I mean, obviously, generally, a lot of police constables are
broader than they were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that there's definitely a drive to make the constable a little bit more terrifying, as opposed to making him a little bit more approachable. Which is, I think, is when you look at the old dresses. I mean, certainly when I speak to my father, you know, he's talking about like what constables were. And you look at like some of the photos that he's got, I mean, they did seem like very approachable, like you were saying, very respectable looking men, you know, whereas now I think certainly with the added addition as well as the illuminated jacket, I suppose the illuminated ones maybe, I don't know, but I think that also drives a fear in some people, because I think that when they see the illuminate jacket, it just piques their heartbeat. You know, because it's very recognisable, and then you instantly picture this rather big man, and I think over, you know, the sort of the behaviours of recent, I think that ties in with the dress that they're wearing.
Mm. So you're suggesting that the dress has actually changed because that's been part of an agenda to change the.
Well, I think
that, put words in your mouth.
No.
Well, that's the case.
No, I think that a lot of the agenda is psychologically driven. And I think that there has been the need to, or the certain apparent need to do that, because I think that a lot of the equipment is not necessarily necessary. I don't think, because at the end of the day, a police constable originally is purposely there to keep the peace, and I'm not sure that all that equipment on there is necessary for that, and that's why I believe that they've purposely been dressed that way to make them more intimidating.
Right. So I'll
I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Well, I actually do, and I've had the pleasure of several police constables coming into my house, and that's been an interesting experience, because I will say one team were there as part of an investigation. So that was one male police constable and one lady police constable, and I have to say they were absolutely excellent. They were professional. They were polite. The issue was quite sensitive because it was to do with the death of a relative, but those police officers very professional, and I was very happy at the end of events to write a thank you letter for their work. I've had other police officers come into my house, two I recall quite fondly, because in my opinion they were definitely there to intimidate. They didn't have a real excuse as to why they were there. They were asking me questions, and when I said, well, why are you asking me this? All I got is because Sergeant Green had sent them. And they were very big blokes. That didn't help them a great deal because the ceilings in my house are very low, so they were rather scrunched up in the corner. But nevertheless, you know, two hulking great blokes looking like they'd stepped out of Afghanistan is not what you want in your house. And I have to say, I agree with you that this style of the police dress, I think, is designed to intimidate people. If we've mentioned the word constable, and I've used police officer,
yeah.
And we're getting into a territory where we will say we're not experts. We've got other policemen out there who are commenting on this fact. John Hurst is one, Albert Birch is another, and there are other serving police officers at the moment. But a lot of people don't realise how the police oath has actually changed over recent years.
Certainly.
Can you comment on that a little bit?
Well, if I just read out the first line of the new oath, which hasn't been it's only been enforced in the last since 1996, so the last sort of 20 years or so. and it simply says, I do solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that I will well and truly serve the Queen in office of constable. And I find, as well as John has mentioned,
John does, the retired policeman,
retired police officer, 30 years, also a Federation representative. He's told me on many occasions that before 1996, the oath was, I do solemnly swear that I will and will truly serve Her Majesty. And I think the important thing there is that Her Majesty is not the Queen, as far as I understand. Her Majesty is the power of the Queen that the Queen has undertaken through her oath. Mm-hmm. And so when one says, I swear to well and truly serve Her Majesty, they're saying, I well and truly serve the power of the realm. What's interesting with the way this oath has been changed is that now that they're serving the Queen, they are serving an individual. Similarly, and I don't mean to draw this comparison half-heartedly, it is, it's a very serious comparison, but Hitler did the same thing when he came into office. He stopped the officers swearing allegiance to Germany, and he made them swear allegiance to him. And it's very interesting, I think, because what it does, I think, subconsciously, it lets the officer or the constable forget that they're serving the country, that they are then serving the Queen. And I've been told on a number of occasions by some overzealous police constables that they have the power to do what they do because the Queen has granted them that power. Well, the Queen hasn't granted them that power. We, the people, have granted them that power, and we are trusting them to do a job. And so I think there is a very major distinction between swearing an oath to the Queen and swearing an oath to Her Majesty.
Yeah, and we know that obviously this new oath has become ingrained in the police. So we'll say the younger police constables don't know any different. They only know the oath that they've sworn. And we've also found, and this isn't with one or two officers, we've been talking quite a lot, we've also found officers who've said, see how I'm mixing these terms, it's interesting, isn't it?
It's psychology, it's difficult,
police constables who were older, who swore the original oath, who don't realise that the younger police constables are swearing a different oath. Yep. And we've had some very good conversations with them. The reason, if I explain for listeners, the reason why Malcolm and myself are laughing over the terminology is because the real terminology is police constable. And the term officer has crept in, and we have police force. So again, we're seeing this change agenda coming in the police, so that we're taking the police from being constables who are selected to help uphold the peace and to protect us, and they are being replaced with a police force which has officers to enforce. So we are showing by the fact that we are slipping up on it, or I'm slipping up on occasions. I am mixing up terms, which is of course exactly what the people who are devising this breakdown of the police want. They want terms that we were comfortable with to slip away, and we start using the new term. The right term is police constable, and I think I mentioned it in last week's programme. Unfortunately, I can't remember the inspector's name, but there's a police inspector, I think from Manchester, who's been speaking out quite forcefully and saying that we need to be dealing with police constables. We need to be back looking at what a police constable is, and we do not need to be going down Theresa May's new police force. So this is very encouraging for us, because we are now starting to see policemen who are beginning to question this fundamental thing about how they've been trained and what the oath is.
Well, I think one of the fundamental differences as well is that a constable was generally out on the beat. He was out in society making it stable. He was a constable, wasn't he? Constable. Whereas now we have police officers who are in an office, who are generally at a desk. They're not out on the beat. They're not doing the job that I'm sure they want to do, which is not the reason why they signed up, I'm sure. And I think that's really the difference in the terminology, is that one describes a gentleman or lady who is out on the beat, and another one describes someone who is in an office. And I think that's the difference for me, fundamentally, the difference between an officer and a constable, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that very briefly, I think that another difference would be that a constable, I think, was endowed with common sense. Not to say that police officers don't have common sense now, but they're not encouraged to act on their common sense. I remember my father telling me a number of times when he was a bit of a tearaway kid, just a young kid, getting up to mischief as you do, getting into swimming pools you should be, and the constable would clip him around the back of the ear roll, he'd take him up to the mother, and he'd say, this is what your son's done, this and this. And I think that there is a more element of common sense, there's more of an element of community within that action. I know we're going to get to officers making legal determinations on the roadside, which is a completely different matter in my view, because I think that the constable's job was really to make the community stable, and it is his job to bring responsibility and an air of common sense, which I think that through the, and again we'll get to the means of training and how officers are trained, or how we see them being trained, and I think that really they're having that power taken away from them because they're told, no, you're not going to think, you're not going to make a decision yourself, you're going to do this, and this is the policy that you follow if somebody does this or if somebody says that. And I think that is a shame, because I think that that's not the reason why majority of people have signed up to the police. I think the majority of people have signed up to the police because they want to aid their community.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. And of course, one of the other things that's been happening, which has changed old style policing, is the fact that you've had a centralisation of police stations. So whereas before, or originally, you had very small community police stations. Well, maybe there was only one police constable there or two, and on occasions that would be shut while they were out on the beat. But basically, there was a police presence in very small communities. We've seen this massive centralisation of police facilities, which has ultimately meant that even though you've got some officers on the beat, they're not embedded in the community as they previously were. And I think that this is actually a retrograde step, because people don't get to know their local policemen. I accept we have community police officers at the moment, and that there are local meetings held, but even so, in many areas it's obvious that there isn't the police presence that there originally was.
And I think we should remember, again, no disrespect to any of the PCSOs, because I'm sure that, again, they're trying to do a fantastic job, but they are impotent compared to a normal police constable, because they haven't sworn an oath of office, which means they don't have the powers of arrest or the same powers of investigation that the normal police constable does. And so again, I don't think that's what the community wants. I think the community wants somebody who is, has got the power, has got the force, and can use it wisely and responsibly, which unfortunately I think PCSOs have been deliberately made impotent in that case. By the policy that's been, not by themselves, but by the policy that is driving them, that they are forced to adhere to.
So I think we could probably argue that this is another one that's been drifted through on a sort of cost-cutting agenda, that we can't afford to put enough fully trained police on the beat. So what we're going to do is bring in semi-trained individuals who are going to help the situation. So the excuse is always, we're back on this money thing, we haven't got the money to put properly trained police officers on the beat.
Sure.
We're going to use a watered down version. That's not to demean people who are in this role, but we're just being a little bit black and white here over what is a real police constable and what isn't. But we're seeing that we've introduced something a role very different from a serving police constable.
Yeah.
I've got to say that I've also, been thinking about the highways agency people that we see. You drive along the motorway, and you see a vehicle. It looks, to all intents and purposes, similar to a police car with a yellow and dark blue checker or whatever it is, but it isn't. It's it's highways agency people.
Yep.
And then we're giving highways agency people sort of responsibility to direct people. So when there's an accident, they are there controlling traffic in a way we might expect the policeman to. And I think that this is being done to actually start to water down our perception of what a real police constable is. That's one thing. And the second thing it's doing is it's starting to get us used to more lower level officials who are gaining more power.
Yep.
And of course, this is also one of the characteristics of Nazi Germany, that when the oppressive regime was fully in force, all sorts of people were given really quite draconian powers in order to enforce what was going on. The station master had powers, some of which would enable them to shop people, almost act like a police officer. And we are seeing this at the moment, that roles which should be done by a fully trained police constable are now being tracked out sideways to people like traffic wardens. And we know that the traffic wardens have been trained and issued with cards on the basis that sometime in the future they may be required to apprehend people and take names and addresses, even if it isn't going to go as far as to arrest them.
Yeah.
But however you look at it, what we are seeing is that the core role of the fully trained and experienced police constable is now being undermined by these other officials who started out doing totally different jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's a classic government technique, isn't it? It's nudging, isn't it, in its purest form. You slowly nudge the real office, which is the office of constable. You slowly nudge that into the office where the person has very little contact with society and is sort of tucked away. And then you introduce this position of office which has little or no power. But then, as you're slowly nudging the office of constable into the office, you're slowly nudging the lower graded position out.
Yeah.
And like we say, they're increasingly getting the same powers as the police, but they're not getting the same responsibilities.
Yeah, and accountability.
And accountability,
those two together.
Because as we say, I mean, although the oath has changed, the oath is still to serve the law, the law of the land. And I think that while we can debate, I'm sure, at great length about what the law of the land is and what it should be and what it shouldn't be, they are accountable for that reason.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the law. Probably this is the time to say what the police are being taught is law, because we've had some very interesting experiences on this when you talk to the police, and the key subject is common law. And it's true to say that a large number of, particularly the younger police officers, are not being taught about common law to the extent they don't believe that common law exists anymore.
No. Well, I think that speaking to the younger officers, I think that they perceive it because it's long and it's old and it's long-standing, that they think, oh well, we've had to modernise it, and that's what statute is. And I'm afraid that you couldn't be further from the truth, because if you look at some great old law books, like the old Houseborough and the old Archibalds, it will tell you that the longer standing the law is, the greater power it has. Certainly in common law, statute's slightly different, but in common law, that is simply the way it is. And common law is not policed by consent. Common law is simply the common law. It's the difference between right and wrong, essentially. Without getting into the depths of it, because I'd like to stay focused on the police as opposed to getting into the law. But whereas statute in itself is policy, it's the policy of a society. And I think that younger police officers would do well, I think, to talk more to the experienced police officers, because I think what statute has done is it's driven a wedge between police constables and society, because society as a whole, although they may not understand the intricacies of law, they can certainly tell when a law is extorting them. And parking on funny coloured lines and doing a few miles over a suggested speed limit is not the difference between right and wrong, because there is no victim in those situations, and therefore there is no culpability at law, only at statute. And I think that is what's helped to drive a wedge between people and the constables, because now they see the constables as this sort of roadside taxman, I think, without being too blasé, I think. But I think that's a fair assessment of what people perceive as the traffic officer.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Well, I would agree with that, and I would also say, and I find this very unfortunate, but if I go back, and I've come back quite a bit to the fact that my ex-military training, taught me lots of things, but also you get a view of things. And originally that military position meant that I was highly supportive of the police. You could sort of understand some of their problems, they worked in a disciplined ranked system, and if the police were under pressure, my reaction would be, they needed help and whatever. Increasingly, and maybe it's wrong, but I do feel it, you see the police and you wonder what they're up to. Why are they there? What are they doing? And you pass the roadside road safety vans, well, probably they've got a civilian inside, but the police are there spying in it, and you're not feeling that the police are actually protecting. You get I don't know, it's almost like a watched feeling.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm not saying that this is fully justified, I'm just talking about what I feel about. But there are a number of police officers who've actually admitted to us that within the police force, the training now for the law is becoming watered down, and that whereas in their day police officers were expected to know the law and to study the books, obviously it's now on-job training and getting young constables out on the beat, and the theoretical knowledge they're expected to have isn't as great, and I think that's partly where the problem's coming to.
Yep.
It might be also that technology has made a difference, because I can see that if you are now on the beat with a radio and you have a problem, let's say you're a young police constable and you're faced with a problem, it's very easy to get on the radio and to ask the sergeant back at base, what do I do? Whereas the old style police constable who was out on the beat, I can imagine in their early days it would be a very lonely place, because a situation would start to present itself and they had to make a decision on the spot, or run along the road to a Doctor Who TARDIS phone. So obviously modern technology has forced change, but I think what we're looking at is that the heart of policing is being slowly dismantled, and I think that Theresa May and the Conservative government are actually deliberately trying to water down the knowledge of the law amongst the police force.
I think so, yeah. I think as we all do in this group, I think we try and talk to police constables as much as we can, and I think that I'd certainly suggest that people listening should do the same thing with the police constables in their community, if nothing else, to build a relationship with them. So if ever you do have a problem, if there is a situation, the police constable will know your face, there will be a human connection there, and there's more chance of them being human. But I remember talking to, not so long ago, when we were doing some investigation into the Occupy London camps. I was talking to a Met police officer, and we were talking about powers of the beat constable. And so I asked him, I said, so if your superior officer, if your sergeant said to you, I'd like you to arrest that man for such and such a crime, but you hadn't seen that man commit such and such a crime, and there was no evidence to suggest that he committed that crime, would you still arrest that man? And he told me flatly, no, he wouldn't. And he reminded me very, very well, in fact, he was very knowledgeable. He was much older. He was very, I'd say he was mid-40s, early 50s, but he reminded me that actually there is no authority higher than the constable on the street. And the constable doesn't have to follow orders. He has his faculties, he has his understanding, and he has the understanding of his community, and that's what he reacts on.
Yeah, so, well, this is a very, very important point, because it is right, and we say to listeners out there, if anything we're saying you don't believe, please challenge us. You can contact the UK column or do some research yourself. But this is a fundamental point, that the sharp end of the police is the constable on the street, and that is the person that makes the decision. Yeah. And all of the rest of the police force, the administrative part, is superficial to that. So the fact that we may have a chief inspector sitting in a very smart office somewhere with his shiny cap and plush carpet, and the trappings of rank and power, as far as the law goes, he does not have authority to usurp the power of the constable making the decision under his powers of constable, under his office of constable on the street. And this is something else that you can see, or another area where you can see that it is the government and the civil service, they've been whittling away at the police. So we've now got senior police officers who've almost been elevated to pop star status. They are very powerful people. They are this. Well, some of them have been going to pop stars parties, I think I remember. But in fact, the real power is held by the lowly police constable on the beat. So there's been a twisting of relative positions of power.
Would you say, given your experience in the Navy, would you say that our policing is becoming ever more militant, in the sense that and I'm only speaking from the Army point of view, I've never been in the Army, my brother has, but I never have, but what comes across is that if a superior officer tells you to do something, you jolly well do it, whereas in the policing sense, it doesn't necessarily work that way. But the military sense very much operates in a pyramidical scheme, which is something we and other listeners, I'm sure, will be very aware of, that certain groups use, and that the policing is becoming ever more hierarchical and more pyramid-like.
Well, I think that is true. That's what I see in the police. I see police who are increasingly, I think they're frightened to move in a lot of circumstances unless they are told by somebody at some distance in a control centre. But I've got to put in something just popped into my mind. I think it's an important thing. There were a lot of the London police who we know were absolutely pulling their hair out when we had the recent riots. When they were on the ground, they had sufficient numbers, they had whatever material they needed, and their instinct on the ground was telling them to move forward and take action to quash what was happening very quickly, and yet they were receiving instructions from senior officers back in the main command central saying, stay where you are, stay where they are. Yeah. And police officers have told us from various parts of the country, because obviously different police forces were brought into London, that they simply could not understand why they were being held, and as one guy said, forced to watch people starting to run amok. And you say very gently, why do you think it was? Was it deliberate? And I have to say, some of the policemen we were talking to were saying yes, they thought they were deliberately held back in order to allow the situation to escalate. And it's quite an amazing situation, really.
Well, I think it is in a sense, because we've got to remember that even the police constables, as far as my knowledge, always have been a separate organisation to government. They're not part of government. They have a contract with government, and if there is a disturbance in the peace, such as was seen in London, then it's the police constabularies which foot the bill.
Yes.
So it's interesting that the senior officers must surely know this, that they ordered their constables to stand back and allow it to happen.
Yeah.
No.
Well, there's another factor in here which I know from personal experience, and that is that if you operate in a control centre, so if we try and paint a picture of this for listeners, we've got a room in there, we're going to have communication, so we're going to have people sat at desks who will be communicating with individual policemen and police cars, police vehicles. We're going to have computer screens with information and data on. We are now certainly going to have access to video via CCTV cameras. But we've got a room, it's going to have quite a few people in there. I'm just going to put a figure, say 20 people sat in front of communications equipment, sat in front of computer screens, sat in front of CCTV screens. And they've all got information, and they are presenting the picture to the senior officer who is in charge of the situation. Now, I know absolutely, because I've been in both situations, I've been in that type of operation centre. I've been in control of that sort of operations centre, and I've also had the experience of being out there in a different place on the front line. And the key thing that you know is that the real picture is always on the front line. If you're there, if you can see the rioters, if you can see where people are moving, you can see the next people moving in, you are there on the ground and you have the picture. By the time that picture is reported into an operations centre, things get missed, things get dropped, things get distorted. And so the more you rely on these remote control centres to actually run the policing operation on the ground, particularly when you're dealing with a complex or a fast-moving situation, the more scope there is for that centralised policing role to fail. And I'd be very happy to go one-to-one with a police officer to talk about this if people out there think I'm wrong on this. So I think even this pyramid structure that you've mentioned for the police force is starting to work against them, because we are seeing power taken away from the policemen on the beat, even when we're bringing together groups of policemen to deal with a bigger incident. And you mentioned the armed forces there. I believe it's a truism that if you look at the difference between the way the British Army worked and the German Army worked in the Second World War, most people would say German Army very efficient, and on a one-to-one situation, equally matched forces, they invariably won. So it's quite interesting looking at some of this. Well, how did the German Army operate? The German Army had put great store in non-commissioned officers, sergeants and corporals, and they were the people who made the decision on the battlefield. So you had relatively small groups of troops, albeit we would say they were very well trained, but the people who were directing them were at sergeant at non-commissioned officer level, and they performed exceptionally well. The British Army tended to work by putting a relatively young officer in charge of the men, and ultimately he had charge of his platoon or company. But of course what you were doing was slightly making the situation slightly more complex, because you might have had an experienced sergeant, but instead of making the decision on his own without any form of interruption, he had to outthink what the young officer wanted. So I'm going to say, having trained within this sort of structured environment, that nothing beats giving the right people the responsibility on the ground.
Well, yeah,
I do that.
I didn't actually. Yeah, I've never come across that, but I certainly would agree, because I mean you can apply that to a community basis as well. Yeah. I mean, with the more and more centralised government that we have, the more feeling that people have that they don't have any control over their lives, the more apathetic people have become, the more community has broken down, and so the less community functions.
Yeah.
You know, we were in a situation where young mothers, they have to send their children out to nurseries and places like that, so that they can go out to work. Whereas if we had a tight-knit community, they would drop the kids off with their friends. You know,
yeah.
So it sounds a very similar sort of thing. I guess what we're suggesting here is the more centralised an organisation becomes, the less capability it has to respond to the
critical events.
The critical events surrounding it. Yeah, that's a very good point.
There's another issue here coming into the way that police are policing, because originally the police force was an autonomous unit, and what was the job of the policeman? Keep the peace, look after people, protect them, but apprehend the criminal. And the policeman's job was to apprehend the criminals wherever they were. So it didn't matter whether the criminal was an ordinary thief on the streets, or the criminal was somebody involved in white-collar fraud. It didn't matter what the rank of the criminal was, Lord X or some lowly thief on the streets. Their job was to actually go for the crime.
Yep.
And the police had complete responsibility to do that. So the police would either detect the crime themselves, or people are going to report to the police that a crime has been committed, and then the police would take action, and the police were deciding whether they'd got enough evidence to take that forward and prosecute. Now, of course, one of the things that has been done is the Crown Prosecution Service has been created, and what that means is that the power of the police has effectively been blunted. So instead of them doing the job on the streets, finding the criminals, collecting the evidence, and then taking through the prosecution process, we've now got the Crown Prosecution Service taking their information and deciding whether the case will be prosecuted. Now, what I believe is absolutely wrong with this is the fact that the Crown Prosecution Service is intimately connected with the legal system, barristers and solicitors who are involved in the court process itself. So now we have a group of people who are actually saying we are above the law, because we are the ones who decide whether this represents a crime and be taken through.
And certainly that they can jump in private prosecutions as well and dissolve a private prosecution if they so wish.
Yeah, and we've seen various police officers actually pointing out that they had done a huge amount of work on a particular case, they'd done everything right and they got X, Y and Z, and yet the Crown Prosecution Service refused to take it forward. And then we come into something which is slightly murkier, which is that we have other cases where police have done very good detective work on cases of child abuse, for example. They've collected the evidence, they know what they're dealing with, and I'm going to say I'm talking from direct information provided to me from policemen, and they've got the case, they've got the evidence, it's been put into a report, and they are driving through for a prosecution of some very, very unpleasant people who are abusing children, including people at high rank, people within the government, and I would say people within the judiciary themselves. And what happens? The report is squashed. It never goes anywhere, it never goes through to the court. Now, of course, if the police system was working properly, the police would actually be on the backs of anybody stopping the prosecution, because that would be perverting the course of justice.
Absolutely.
So now we've got the position where the police are, I've used the term blunted, but basically they've got a layer over the top of them where people have vested interests, where people are not the police, and yet they're deciding whether stuff will or will not go through into the courts. And I personally believe that the Crown Prosecution Service, the creation of it, was designed to give the government greater control over the police and the police powers to prosecute and apprehend criminals.
Yeah.
I'm going to say in positions of the elite.
Well, yeah, I'd say so, because I think whilst it may well be some of the governments that push the levers to prevent the Crown Prosecution or suggest the Crown Prosecution, that they don't follow up cases, I would imagine it's the people pushing the buttons of the politicians that really are making that happen. So I would totally agree with you on that. I think while we're here talking about this particular aspect, I think it's interesting, going back to Theresa May's speech, that she has said that there's attempts to reduce bureaucracy, which would basically enable the police to prosecute in a further 500,000 different minor sort of, I don't want to say crimes, because they're not crimes, they're offences. So they'll be able to prosecute in a further 500,000 offences, which I suppose could give us the scope of the kind of legislation that we're dealing with here. But I think the point I'm trying to make, I would like to make here, is that whilst that sounds like we're giving constables back the power that they had, I think personally that it's a power too far, because I think there's a big distinction between a police constable being able to investigate a particular crime and then follow it through to prosecution, as opposed to a police constable on the side of the road, which is really what she's talking about, being able to give on-the-spot fines, which essentially is conviction on the side of the road. Now, my understanding of the law is that constables are not legally trained, therefore they cannot make a legal decision on the side of the road, because that would be in contradiction to the Bill of Rights, which basically says that no fines can be dished out before conviction. And I think if Mike was here, he'd also be able to add in that it's a further attack on the separation of powers, because the whole point is that we separate the powers between the people who make the law, the people who determine the law, and the people who then go and chase the criminals, to ensure that there is more of a sort of non-biased approach. Now, I haven't got any evidence for this, but I would imagine that there are some incentives for police constables to keep a particular rate of convictions going in order for them to...
Well, we know this is the case because, of course, consecutive governments, Labour and Conservative, have been ramming targets at the police.
Right.
So that is absolutely the case.
Right. Well, then there would be a massive conflict of interest, would there not, if a gentleman or a gentle lady was pulled over on the side of the road by a police constable who is maybe a little bit lacking that week in his targets, and he's got the power to not only to pull that person over, but to make the accusation and make the judgment against that person all in one swipe. So when Theresa May is talking about giving constables back the power to prosecute up to 500,000 cases a year, what she's saying is it's a legal determination and not a return to what the constables previously had, which was a greater control over the cases themselves.
Yeah. So we're seeing another... how do we describe it? It's another diversion on what proper policing should be.
It is. It's almost like problem, reaction, solution in a way, isn't it? You know, you create the problem that the police have been, they've had their powers taken away, and the reaction of the public is like, that's not fair, that's not good for the community, and so the solution as well will give them greater powers. But unless people are of a sort of a lawful mind or a legal mind to understand that people making judgments and accusations at the same time is a complete conflict of interest, which I don't think not a lot of people do, because they presume the police are properly trained, and they presume that there's a lot of presumptions made on that case. And so I think that that's really an attack on that. Yeah.
So we think Theresa May is up to her tricks. Something which I just jotted down a few minutes ago is of course something else which is happening with the police, and it's to do with this, how the police can act as an integral body, an autonomous unit. And this, what's taken place, particularly under the Blair administration, is that the police have been drawn into partnerships. So previously we had our police constables, and at the end of the day quite fearsome in a way, because they would go for anybody who was breaking the law. I don't mind, sir, if you're a judge or you're selling apples, I'm going to go for you. And now what we've got is the police being drawn into partnerships, and these are happening right the way across the country, particularly in city areas, but if we take one form of partnership at the moment, we can look at social services and child protection. So in each area we now have child protection boards, which is a partnership. When we look at who's in the partnership, we have the local authority, we have children's services, we have the police, we have other child protection agencies, and in some cases we've got charities involved as well. So we may have NSPCC, for example, involved. And decisions to do with the safety and welfare of the children are made by those collective boards. Now this is a very interesting situation, because what it means is that the police are actually becoming very cosy with other organisations. And at the moment we've been looking at a number of incidences around the country where you can see that child protection boards are failing. One of the key ones is in Oxford, where a number of abuses of young people have been reported to the column. And when we go to look at who should be taking action, we come back to the two key people. The key organisation, will be the local authority, So that's Oxfordshire County Council. But the action's not being taken, and then we see the local police wavering. And you say, why are they wavering? Well, they're wavering because they have actually sat on the very same safeguarding board which has failed. Now the police are in a very interesting position, because if they go full in to expose what's really happening and deal with the criminals, oh dear, actually the local police force are complicit themselves, aren't they? Because they sat in the original board. Yeah. Quite passionate about this particular case, because at the end of it we are seeing young people who have been abused and are at risk of further abuse. No action is happening because you've got one body, including the police, which is failing to move. You can look at it in a different way. I'll give you a factual example. In Plymouth, in the Devonport area of the city, which is around the old naval dockyard, which became, as the dockyard ran down, became quite a deprived area. We had a government New Deal programme running, in which some 49 million was donated to help the regeneration of that Devonport area. What then happened was that money came in with very little financial controls, and I'm going to say a lot of the money disappeared, but also some of the money was used within the regeneration partnership to pay the police for policing, which should normally be done by them anyway. So you began to get the impression of a nice little situation where the police were desperate for extra funding. Oh, we can go and give it to Devonport because they can afford to pay. Now, what I can suggest the listeners started to happen was that the police allegiance began to shift a bit. And what was actually doing it? Well, it was twofold. It was the fact that instead of being detached and equal for all equally handed for all communities, instead of the police acting in that traditional role, they were now being drawn into partnership, where if you're sat around a table with other agencies and you're making agreements with them, well, when the chips are down, you feel an obligation to go with your partners. And I think it's, I'm just going to throw this in, but we talked about leadership and change, and we know that Common Purpose has been particularly active in the police and in police training. And of course, what Common Purpose talks about is leadership outside authority. Now, this is a very interesting expression for the police, because is Common Purpose suggesting that police officers can go and do things outside their authority? Because the answer must be no. Because if they act outside their authority, how are they accountable? So we are seeing that the police, instead of being this detached, upstanding force, where if they do something wrong it's pretty clear and the punishment's pretty severe, they're now being drawn into this network of partnerships with other people. And I believe this is a very insidious attack on the police to water down their powers. I might also just add that Devonport was the area where the police, talking about their uniforms, where the police trialled briefly, the police having a little video camera attached just above the right ear, I think it was, on their cap. And so if you met a policeman on the street, you were already being videoed as a potential criminal. Pretty 1984 stuff, really. Yeah.
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of that.
We'd also jotted down here police behaviour.
Yes.
Changes in police behaviour.
Police behaviour, yes. I guess this is you'll probably be able to say more about that as opposed, when you bring in the fact of how they're trained and the sort of techniques that's being used to train, and particularly Common Purpose. I remember a particular article, actually, just to draw the attention to the viewer. Obviously, it's a video, but I can't actually play it. But if you Googled policeman suspended for attack on disabled man's Range Rover, I think you will find a video of a gentleman being chased by police, and it's true that he didn't pull over perhaps as quickly as he should have done. But bearing in mind, this is an elderly man, I'd say he's in his 70s.
He's 73, actually.
73. And basically, when they pulled him over, the police would appear to have completely lost the plot, and 3 police officers ran at the Range Rover. One started repeatedly batting the windscreen with his baton, really quite aggressively. Another one jumped up on the bonnet, and started stamping in the front windscreen. And while another one shouted continuously at the elderly gentleman. And I think that the point to be made is that the man was made the heinous mistake or crime of not wearing his seatbelt.
Yeah.
And I think that this kind of policing is obviously way over the top. But I would suggest, and maybe you're going to elaborate a little bit more onto why police maybe behave in these ways.
Well, that video I have watched several times, and it is incredible because we've got the 73-year-old man sat in the driver's seat whilst a policeman with a baton hammers in his driver's window. Yeah. So he was being showered in chunks of glass, albeit safety glass. He's got a policeman standing on the bonnet, kicking the windscreen in. If any listeners don't think this happened, please get on YouTube and look for it. But I can tell you that the police have already had to pay out several tens of thousands of pounds compensation to this gentleman. But the aggressive attitude of the policeman on the spot is breathtaking. In fact, the one trying to hammer in the driver's side window is so intent on battering the window in, he nearly hits his colleague in the face with his baton as he draws his hand back. His colleague just manages to get out of the way. So we're seeing policemen acting incredibly aggressively, and more people are reporting this. We've seen it with the death of I can't think of the guy's name, but up in London, he was tripped over or pushed to the ground by a policeman, and he died. We have seen policemen pulling a man out of a wheelchair, paraplegic, pulled out of his wheelchair in a very aggressive manner. And more people are saying that they find the police very aggressive in their attitude. It's not, "Hello sir, how can I help you?" It's in your face. Even the look of some of the police, particularly big guys, lots of muscle, lots of tattoos, very short hair, nightclub bouncer style. We're seeing more of these. Why is this happening? Now, there's got to be reasons for it. Now, we're getting clues because we know that the way police are recruiting is changing, and many seasoned police officers are saying that the actual educational and personal qualifications is declining or being deliberately overlooked. But we're also seeing that we now have more outside training organisations coming in to train the police. Common Purpose is one of them, but we're seeing many companies coming in to do police training who are using NLP. And this is hearsay, but I'm going to say to the listeners, I'm sure what I was told was correct. But I was told that recently some police officers from a police force asked one of the police psychiatrists what their view on NLP was, and his response was pretty clear-cut. He said, "I think it is very dangerous." So we've got outside agencies coming in and using NLP in police training, and we know from NLP trainers themselves that NLP in the wrong hands can completely change people's personalities and values. We've had the wife of a policeman who contacted us, admittedly some time ago, but she had a fascinating story about the man she'd been married to for 17 years. One day he'd done a police diversity training course, and she said within a couple of weeks of that training, my husband changed. He became different, he became aggressive. And she remarked that she had sat with her husband watching television, and she said if there was anything to do with the public, perhaps there was demonstrators, he became unbelievably aggressive. "You see those people out there, we've got to deal with those people. It's us against them." And she said she found it quite scary, and his behaviour continued to change until ultimately she went on holiday with him for a week, and she said, by the middle of the week, I knew I had to leave him because he was a different man, and I didn't like the man he'd become. Now, we've got other police talking to us about policemen having personality changes. We've got serving police officers contacting the column, talking about colleagues who do training and they change, and listeners can go onto the internet themselves and start to research police training, and you will find NLP consultancies now buried in the police training colleges. So that is certainly one thing that's happening. The other thing, of course, is we're now getting this training policy change coming through the Association of Chief Police Officers and through Eurogen 4, the European police system. And of course, what we're seeing is the deliberate training of police, which is taking them into more militaristic type situations. So we come back to your description. They've got a stab proof vest, they've got a radio, they're carrying one or two tasers, they're carrying a baton.
Cuffs are on the front instead of
they're carrying cuffs, they're carrying the little nylon securing bands, I can't think what you call them, but ties. And their whole demeanour is military, and I'm going to say I believe, because I haven't been there in any of the training facilities, but everything I pick up is that they are doing more and more training which is taking them through a process as if they were in the army training to fight. And you see particularly the police firearms teams, and we've got to remember that these firearms teams have killed, I believe they've murdered people. We had the banker shot up in London. Admittedly, he'd fired a shotgun, but he at the time he was shot, he was not putting anybody's life in immediate danger, and his girlfriend or partner said at the time she was horrified at how he was just shot. So we've got these police firearm teams that are also being trained in a very aggressive manner, and we've had recent pictures in the paper of black hooded police firearm teams. So now we're in the business that we've got very aggressively trained police. We're not even allowed to see their face. So this is very different from our original Bobby on the beat, who was still expected to tackle armed criminals, but he did it unarmed.
Who was, of course, primarily a peacemaker. You know, he was a keeper of the peace.
Did I say black clothing? Black clothing. Dressed in black clothing.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, we've got about 3 minutes left, so I suppose
Where's it going?
Where's it going? Well, I mean, where is it going? One would probably imagine that if we keep heading the way we are, then the police forces, or the police constabularies as we know them, will cease to exist. They will run out of money, they will run out of funding, I would imagine, will run out of people on the street, and we'll be left with people who are working for foreign companies, foreign policing agents who will be on our streets, most likely armed, and will not have the allegiance to us that our good old constables have.
Yeah, indeed. And we've got a tremendous example of this unfolding before our eyes, because if we look at these incredible security arrangements about the Olympics, 30,500 troops on the street and twice the number of police. But who's in control of the overall security is G4S. So we've got a global security company which is now taking control of, it's not security, is it? It's policing on British streets.
Absolutely.
And we've got a foreign company that's been given the overall. Who is this foreign company? Who is the board of directors? What are their interests? So I think that the police are at a tipping point, really. Long-serving policemen, experienced policemen, know something's wrong, and they've expressed that at the policing conference. They've shown some guts because they've given Theresa May quite a hard time. But this woman is pushing through the privatisation of British police. Once it's privatised, there will be no going back. I think we need to do something about it, basically.
Well, I think it'll be a sense of the same with the new bobbies. We'll just, our younger generation coming up will just accept the reality that they will be presented with, which will be that private organisations will be policing our streets.
Yeah.
So
sorry.
Would you like to?
We can see other signs with this. We've mentioned the Olympics there. That's on a massive scale, but other people are talking to us about being arrested by the police, and once they've gone through the initial check-in procedure, they're going down to cell areas where the people handling them are dressed all in black.
Yep.
And one man who is ex-military and ex-paratrooper, so I'm going to say he's not a shy man, but he said it was quite intimidating because I disappeared down to 2 underground levels. I'm in an area of cells. I'm surrounded by men in black. They have no names, they have no badges, they have no numbers. And he said, I don't know he didn't know who they were at the time. We believe that they were G4 security, now taking over the role of police constables. So this man is being held by absolutely unknown individuals. And I've got to say, the thing that really focuses my mind is Theresa May is doing what she's doing to the police. That's one end. We've got Ken Clarke, who is busily trying to push through secret courts. Combination is very serious. Okay.
Right, well, we've been given the nod. I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who's been listening, and we hope you've enjoyed the show. And
we hope you'll join us next week.
Next week, what's on the show next week? Do we know yet?
I think we'd like to look at wider political issues in UK. So we've touched on what's happening in communities, what's happening in society. Why is this country changing? Why doesn't it work?
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you again for listening, and. In the words of David Cameron, I'd like to say, instead of hugging a hoodie, why not go out and hug a bobby and try and build some relationships between the community and the police force. Thank you for listening.